Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Loiter. I am a principal researcher at NRRI. Your questions, your input contribute a great deal to the success of the webinar and the learning that goes on here. So please send in your questions. You're using the Q&A feature at any time, and the panelists and the moderator will be keeping an eye on that, and they'll do their best, and we'll do our best to get as many of them answered as possible over the next 90 minutes. Each of the three panelists are going to speak just briefly. They don't have presentations. They're going to provide some introductory comments to sort of frame the issues. And then Commissioner Anthony will moderate the discussion about best practices for sustainable commercial EV charging rates and new PURPA factors related to that. We can go to Miles for the first presentation.
Great. So good morning, everyone. My name is Miles Muller. I'm an attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC for short. NRDC is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to protection of the environment, with more than 700 scientists, lawyers, advocates, and over 3 million members. Over the last several decades, NRDC has worked to cut pollution from the transportation sector through pushing for stronger emission and fuel economy standards in passenger vehicles and trucks, policies encouraging the adoption of electric vehicles, advocating for cleaner fuels, and policies that reduce the need to drive. My work at NRDC focuses on transportation electrification, advocating for policies and investments that accelerate the electrification of cars, buses, and trucks, as well as the transition to a cleaner and more affordable electric grid. Now, as the title of the webinar suggests, we're here today to talk about best practices for commercial EV charging rates and key considerations for regulators and utilities evaluating new commercial EV rates as directed by the recent amendments to PURPA 111D in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I'll give a quick overview of the amendments to PURPA 111D and recent developments in commercial EV rate design across the country, including what are the barriers that traditional commercial and industrial rates pose for electrification? What are some of the models that have been adopted in states and utilities across the country to address these problems? What are some of the pros and cons of these approaches? And how regulators and utilities can pull from some of these early models in going about implementing PURPA 111D and designing long-term sustainable solutions. So let's start with what are the problems that traditional commercial and industrial, or C&I rates, pose for transportation electrification, and how does EJA fit into all this? So I think, like we're all aware, electric buses, trucks, and public fast charging stations aren't like buildings. EVs charge for only a few hours a day, or even shorter periods at public fast charging stations. In many locations, they can also shift their charging demand to when most people are sleeping, and there's plenty of spare capacity on the grid. But until now, they've generally been forced onto rate plans designed for larger buildings and industrial operations that use electricity more constantly. Most traditional C&I rates include demand charges based on customers' highest point of demand in a given month. And because EVs consume a lot of electricity when plugged in, those demand charges mean big bills, because EV charging tends to be spikier than traditional loads. And this means that charges get spread over fewer units of use, and thus result in higher effective per kilowatt hour prices. This can erase fuel cost savings relative to gas and diesel, undermining the economic case for electrification. On traditional C&I rates in many states, the cost of EV charging is often equal to or more expensive than filling up with gas or diesel. Some utilities have begun to acknowledge this issue by designing new rates specifically for commercial EV charging, and new commercial EV rates that more accurately reflect the flexible nature of EV charging relative to traditional commercial and industrial loads, and provide meaningful reductions in monthly charging costs for drivers and fleet operators, could significantly improve the economics of a decision to invest in these vehicles, including medium and heavy duty EVs, and enable widespread transportation electrification that can help improve grid utilization and help states achieve their climate, equity, and air quality goals. And as a note, early data from some of those early models show that new commercial EV rates, customers taking service on those rates are saving anywhere from 25 to 60% or more on their monthly bills, and paying less than half the price they would have if they used gas or diesel. So in short, the goal of sustainable long-term commercial EV rates is to improve the economics of commercial EV adoption during the critical developing years of the market to help foster EV adoption and facilitate some of these goals, to provide significant fuel cost savings to drivers and fleet operators who charge in a manner that supports the electric grid, reflect the underlying costs, the underlying marginal costs of serving commercial EV load, and avoid subsidizing EV charging or shifting costs to other customers. So while there are a handful of approaches that have been put into place over the last couple of years, these considerations now have a more national import as the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act amends Purple 111D to require regulators and non-regulated utilities to consider new rates to support transportation electrification. And those amendments direct regulators and utilities across the country to consider rates that, and this is a quote from these amendments, promote affordable and equitable EV charging options for residential, commercial, and public EV charging infrastructure, improve the customer experience associated with EV charging, accelerate third-party investment in EV charging for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles, and appropriately recover the marginal cost of delivering electricity to EVs and EV charging infrastructure. And PURPA directs each state regulatory authority and each non-regulated utility to commence consideration of new rates by this fall, 1 year after enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and to complete consideration within the following year. Now, just to give a short overview of some of the models that have been put into place so far, these span the gamut from things like short-term subsidies to mitigate demand charges, demand charge holidays, subscription-based rates, low load factor rates, and in some cases, even economic development rate riders. So just to start with some of the earliest models, Southern California Edison back in 2018 established an EV rate that temporarily ditches demand charges for 5 years, recovering costs purely through time of use rates. After 5 years, demand charges will get phased back in, with the underlying theory being that this is really important right now during the developing years of the market. But as time goes on and there are more EVs on the road, charging station utilization will increase, and those customers can spread those demand charges over a greater volume of charging. This will probably hold true generally, but demand charges could still pose a problem in locations that don't see higher levels of utilization and might never see them. So although the demand charge holiday was initially proposed for a period of 5 years, recently, I believe Edison proposed to extend this period by another 2 years. And so this shows that demand charge holidays are one model that have been put into place, but sometimes come with uncertain glide paths to full cost rates and could be subject to future requests for extensions. So this could be an important consideration for regulators looking for long-term sustainable solutions. Pacific Gas and Electric, also in California in 2019, took a ground-up approach in designing new C&I EV rates. They partnered with EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, to conduct customer outreach to inform the rate design. That approach permanently ditches demand charges, replacing them with smaller and more predictable subscription fees. Those fees are pretty similar to what you see on your cell phone bill, with sites paying a fixed monthly rate based on their total charging capacity. But unlike a typical cell phone bill, that fee only accounts for a relatively small portion of the total bill. The majority of the bill is determined by time of use charges, encouraging customers to charge when the grid is underutilized and when renewable energy is abundant. And early implementation data from that rate shows that customers on the new rate plan are saving 25 to 60% or more on their monthly bills. And that's true across both DCFC, workplace sites, and multifamily sites that are all taking service on that rate. Following PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric also developed a subscription-based rate. Notably, SDG&E has some of the highest rates in the country. So they proposed new C&I rates that also ditch demand charges for those more predictable monthly subscriptions. But notably in that case, SDG&E's rate goes beyond PG&E's model to collect only marginal distribution and commodity costs. And there's some background here with what the commission imposed for PG&E's rate that we don't need to get into now, but builds upon some directives from the commission in PG&E's rate to only collect marginal costs in the early years of SDG&E's rate, while phasing those costs back in linearly over a 10-year period. The commission's final decision in that case directed SDG&E to make those modifications to align with a set of principles that were set out in a joint party settlement agreement that had support from a diverse group of organizations, including SDG&E, the state's official consumer advocate, organized labor, a number of environmental groups, as well as a number of charging companies. So there's no implementation data yet from SDG&E's rate, but SDG&E estimates the customers taking service on that rate will save roughly 20 to 50% on their monthly bills. And notably, that rate was in part in the Commission's approval meant to align with the Commission's historical treatment of economic development rate load and to reduce the likelihood of the rate imposing additional costs on other ratepayers. So this is something that we maybe can get into later in the Q&A. But in short, the Commission directed SDG&E to treat commercial EV load as incremental and to review implementation data as time goes on to make sure that SDG&E is collecting more than those customers' marginal cost of service, making sure that it results in a positive contribution to margin. And if data shows that there is a negative contribution to margin in the long term, making sure requires SDG&E to come forward with a proposal modifying that to eliminate any under collection. So guardrails that are protecting existing ratepayers, making sure there aren't unintended cost shifts to other customers. In other states, there are really interesting models as well. Something I just learned about yesterday here at CRUC is that Alabama Power has an economic development rate rider, which customers enrolled on their business EV rate can enroll in. Those customers' base rate is discounted by 110% of their estimated marginal cost based on their specific service characteristics, including their location, load, and load shape. So another interesting approach, which is more tech neutral than SDG&E's, that EDI rider is open to not just EVs, but other types of incremental load. So another interesting model for utilities and regulators to consider. Other types of rates that have been explored by utilities include low load factor rates from Madison Gas and Electric and Dominion Energy. Arizona Public Service and Florida Power and Light have done demand limiter rates. Excel in Colorado has a rate that lowers demand charges by shifting costs over to the time-varying energy charges and critical peak pricing. And there are other models like National Grid that have sliding scales with a demand charges based on utilization. That's their 10-year tariff-based discount program. So that's just an example of some of the early models. I'll stop there and turn it over to the next panelist, but hopefully that gives an overview of both the amendments to Purple 111D and some of the early models that have been put into place.
Great, thank you, Miles. I think we're going to go right to, unless a different order was discussed, I think we'll go to Alyssa next. Alyssa Berger from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation.
Thanks. I'm at CalSTART, yes. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Alyssa Berger. I am the Regional Policy Director with CalSTART. For those that are not familiar, CalSTART is a nonprofit organization working nationally and internationally with business and governments to develop clean, efficient transportation solutions. So we have offices across the United States. We do a lot of work outside of California, despite what the name might signal. And then last year at COP, we were part of an global MOU announcement around medium and heavy duty commercial vehicle goals. So we've started to do a lot more work internationally as well. And I will put a link to that effort in the chat. We are not a trade association. Again, we're a nonprofit, but we do work with our membership base, which are comprised of companies, agency innovators, all working on clean transportation. And really the organization has two goals. One is to reduce U.S. transportation emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and to ensure all regions achieve federal air quality standards to support clean air for all. I appreciate you letting me get through that intro. I think sometimes people are not as familiar with CalSTART and the work that we're doing. Basically, we do a lot on commercial buses and truck electrification. We also do a lot of work with infrastructure planning and alternative fuel corridors, and we've been starting to do more work around innovative mobility. In my role as Regional Policy Director, I help organize a group of our members that participate in the Coalition for Commercial EVs, which goes by CCEV. We're a group that has submitted and participated in a number of proceedings related to the issues that Miles went over. And I think that in response to Miles' presentation, and just to add CalSTART is really involved in the work of seeing these vehicles become zero emission, and the importance of something like reducing these demand charges so that it is an economically viable option for the fleets that we're working with, for local governments, state governments. And so this is just an extremely important aspect, I think, to the overall transformation, making our transportation sector zero emissions. So broadly, there's a number of things that I think commissions and utilities can think about as it relates to electric vehicles. And certainly there's a whole aspect we won't be covering around make ready. I do want to stress that as state governments, DOTs are preparing their NEVI plans that will be submitted to the joint office this August 1st, that there's going to be a lot of focus on light duty vehicles, and that's absolutely warranted. There are also a lot of vehicles that are medium and heavy duty, so those larger classes of vehicles that need to be zero emission as well, and in this instance, electric. So what are we doing to make sure that that's a possibility? And I think, again, that's where this language that was in IIJA around Purple 111D in terms of accessibility and affordability, and this looking at these demand rate structures is just so crucially important. I sort of want to end it there because I'm more interested in getting into the questions and answers. We are currently tracking proceedings across 20 states, and I don't have the subtotal of how many of those touch commercial EV rates. For example, the New York PSC currently has a proceeding open right now. They just had a workshop on Monday that was very informative, and I'd be happy to share out some more resources to staff as that's something we have aggregated. But as an individual who has been to a number of different site visits with fleets with these larger classes of vehicles, again, in order to see those operational and really scale in terms of the number of vehicles, I think something like the commercial EV rate structure will be absolutely paramount and really transformational for how much change we can make in a short amount of time. So with that, I will conclude and pass it back over to the commissioner to hand it over to Nancy, but I'm really looking forward to the question and answer, the dialogue. There's a lot here. I think the Purple 111D language has sort of flown under the radar, but as the paper will point out, and as Miles sort of touched upon, I think this is a very exciting opportunity and looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alyssa. We'll go right to Nancy and then we'll get into the questions. So next we have Nancy Ryan, who is with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Nancy.
So actually, let me begin by saying that I consult with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, but I'm here as an individual in my capacity as a partner with e-mobility advisors. Our firm works with organizations that are in the vanguard of transportation electrification, businesses, governments, nonprofit organizations like NRDC, and we work to help them achieve their missions in the support of the overall mission of advancing transportation electrification. Another hat I wear is that with my partner Colleen Quinn, we are co-organizers of the National EV Charging Initiative, which is an unprecedented coalition of 35 regional and national groups that, among other things, includes the Alliance for Automotive Innovation and the Edison Electric Institute and some public utility commissioners are working, advising us as well. And the initiative is committed to building out the national EV charging ecosystem in a way that's equitable, affordable, accessible to all, convenient, and to do it in a way that the taxpayer and ratepayer funds that are being dedicated to transportation electrification get leveraged by a factor of 10x or more by funds raised in the private capital markets, because really that is the scale of the transformation. So turning to my opening remarks, if you looked at my bio, you'll see I've had a varied career with time spent in academia as a consultant and as an environmental advocate like Miles, and as a regulator. I served on the California Public Utilities Commission for a year, and also spent several years working there with the president of the commission, who was very active in, among other things, promoting transportation electrification. So I thought what I would do is shuffle a couple of my different hats I've worn to provide some context for some more theoretical context for the remarks that Miles and Alyssa made, and to maybe set the stage for the discussion that follows. So, putting on my economist hat, I'll say, economics purports to be a science. We call economics a social science, and efficiency is the North Star of economic efficiency is the North Star of the profession, or of the field. And, with a focus on really ensuring that resources are put to their highest and best use. So there's a lot of economics in the practice of rate of return regulation. And I think in that context, the important application of the North Star efficiency principle is cost-based rates. And there's a lot of work that goes into breaking down cost, to differentiating between what truly is a marginal cost versus a fixed cost. Is something a marginal cost in the short run or in the long run? And how do those factors get reflected in rates? And a lot of the discussion around demand charges really centers on, to what extent are these really, are they cost-based, and are they short-term or long-term costs? So, I think if you take a very strict perspective, the demand charge really shouldn't reflect the non-coincident demand charge really shouldn't reflect any more than the cost of the final line transformer and the conduit and conductors that connect a particular site. Now, that can be substantial for a large DC fast charging plaza, but in a strict sense, if you really look at things from a cost-based perspective, that's what you winnow it down to. And you wouldn't load up that demand charge with other fees or recovering the cost of other services. But I think transitioning from my economist hat to my public policy hat, I think it's important to remember first that we're not in a perfect world when we regulate utilities. We're already dealing with the fundamental issue of declining marginal costs, which is the whole reason we have rate of return regulation. But there are also pervasive externalities throughout the whole energy ecosystem, both on the fossil side and on the electricity side. And the ultimate externality is, of course, greenhouse gas pollution and the impact it has on the climate and the health of ecosystems and people. We also have to contend with market power and asymmetric information. And that's really where, we transition into a core objective in policy, which is market transformation, and the recognition that there are technologies that mitigate externalities, that if we're not fully pricing those externalities through carbon taxes or a cap and trade program, then we need to pursue other policies or other policy levers, pull on other policy levers to achieve our market transformation goals. And there's, a long history of doing that for energy efficiency. I think economists used to scoff at doing that for energy efficiency and said, show me the market failure. But today there are energy efficiency institutes associated with economics departments at highly respected academic institutions, including Stanford and the University of California at Davis. So I think the profession has really turned around. And this is very much the situation with transportation electrification as well. And what we heard from Alyssa in particular in her remarks is how critical it is to make sure that the total cost of ownership prospect for a fleet owner in this transitional phase is viable. And similarly, Miles talked about the business case for DC fast charging. And as we are in this transitional period with a nascent industry, how do we balance the desire to achieve market transformation, do it in an equitable fashion, with economic efficiency. And I think we can bring both of those together, and some of the rate designs Miles talked about accomplish that. And I'll just close by citing something that I think we can think of as the North Star for rate design, which is James Wright's principles for rates, of which there are 7. And I pulled down a presentation from NARUC's website that lists them out. I'll just mention a couple: simplicity, understandability, public acceptability, and feasibility of application interpretation. That's one. Another is fairness in apportioning cost of service among different consumers, and another, avoidance of undue discrimination. And again, that's art, that's not science. And finally, and the last and only one of 7 is efficiency, promoting efficient use of energy and competing products and services. So as we practice the art of rate design in the context of looking to achieve market transformation, or at least adapt to a big new load that's coming, we need to look at all of these different pieces, and I think we'll do that over the course of our discussion today. So thank you, Commissioner Anthony. I'm looking forward to our discussion as well as the Q&A.
Great, thank you. And I'll give a minute for Miles and Alyssa to come back. So while we're waiting for Alyssa, I would just share that I'm Abigail Anthony. I'm a utility regulator on the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. I'm also the chair of NARUC's Environment and Energy Resources Committee. And what I'm really bringing to this panel today is my role as a utility regulator. I think a lot of what we've heard about from our panelists is electrification from the perspective of transportation goals or the transportation sector. And I don't regulate transportation. We don't have transportation goals here. Our utility doesn't have transportation goals. We're really looking at this as utility regulators, and in the context of minimizing the cost of our power system. So some of the questions I'm going to ask today might seem to challenge some of the premises that we've heard here, even the premise of this whole panel itself. But I think it's going to be a fun conversation. But I want to just start maybe with maybe a lighter question for everybody. Welcome to answer. But what is either the best or the worst thing that has happened for your transportation or your organization's transportation goals over the last 12 months or so? And maybe let's go, Nancy, if you want to jump in, and then we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the funding for EV charging infrastructure in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $7.5 billion specifically for EV infrastructure. So that's a huge infusion of public funds that will go. $5 billion will be spread across all the states according to a formula, and the other $2.5 billion will be administered by the federal DOT with an emphasis on enhancing community charging options. So that's great news, and a time that hasn't always seemed like the best of times.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off Nancy's answer. I think, the federal funding is sending a very clear signal to the market and really trying to make sure that there is infrastructure out there to help facilitate adoption of electric vehicles. In addition, in some states, we're seeing, at least in California, a pretty big investment in ZEVs and ZEV infrastructure. The governor has proposed a total $10 billion zero emission vehicle package building off of last year's allocation in that budget. And there are also some ballot measures that are live right now in California that would allocate an additional up to $4 billion annually. So I think we're seeing a lot of money coming out to help support the deployment of this infrastructure. Getting to the second half of the question, like what are some of the less than great things that have happened? I think at the same time, we're seeing higher electricity prices, there are supply chain issues, there are delays in folks getting these EVs. And I think longer term, there are questions about how do we make sure that even if we have all this money, we can deploy that infrastructure in a timely manner to meet the level of adoption that we might see. And so I think in California, we have, and with the federal money across the country, a lot of money flowing to this, but there are still a lot of implementation issues to figure out.
Well, that's the peril of going last. The best answers are taken, but I completely agree with that. I have been immersed in reading a lot of the guidance that's been coming out, the 84 pages of the notice of proposed rulemaking from FHWA on the NEVI guidance. And there's a really big, emphasis on standardization, which I think is hugely exciting. I think for the commission staff we have in the audience, people can appreciate how things are so different state to state. I think with this element of standardization in terms of charging infrastructure, that's going to be a really great thing both for implementers and on the customer side across vehicle classes. And then, I think the challenging part there is just how many cooks are in the kitchen right now. I do want to underscore what Miles said. Vehicle availability is really challenging right now. Supply chain issues, absolutely. And not that it's only affecting the EV industry, that's affecting industries, across the spectrum. And I think there's certainly a timing element right now as we see gas prices go up and companies and drivers want to turn to electric vehicles. Do they have the option to access those vehicles? And then do they have the charging infrastructure available to charge their vehicle? So there's definitely a symphony element to this. I'm not sure who the conductor is in my example, but I have been truly impressed with how, people rolling up their sleeves from DOT offices, commissions, energy offices, governor's offices, as well as all of the federal agencies wanting to make this opportunity work as it relates to IIJA. And it's not just NEVI, there's a number of other funding buckets that are forthcoming, like the carbon reduction program and existing funds like FTA, LONO, and CMAQ that will also be available for states to access to stand up programs like voucher incentives for vehicles and infrastructure, clean mobility grants. But again, when we look at implementation, it just has to work from an economics perspective, and that TCO outcome is so important, as Nancy said, and we keep going back and forth. And I just want to say again, to make this more real, I was recently out in LA and I went to a fleet depot as a charging service area near the airport at LAX, where you have the hotel shuttle buses and other sort of class 3, class 4, and 5 vehicles coming in. The drivers can get out and get lunch while their vehicles charge. And it was really impressive to see. The drivers had shared with us that they fight to get to their places early so they can get the EV buses and shuttle buses. They actually found their tips are more. People just think it's really cool. But for all of this to work, it means a close relationship with the utility and the commission. And so that for me was like, I was so excited to be driving a class 5 electric bus. I was allowed to take it around, shuttle truck around the neighborhood with supervision. But at the same time, I was also really panicked because in my mind, my nerdy mind, I'm thinking about, total cost of ownership. What are demand charges going to do? Is it going to dampen enthusiasm for fleets that want to go electric? So kind of a long answer. It's so exciting right now because of IIJA and the money it's literally affording states who have not had these buckets for transportation electrification. But at the same time, the number of players involved is significant, and it's going to require a lot of communication and coordination.
Hey, thanks, Alyssa. In case unless anyone wants to respond to that, could you say a little bit more about, what I'm hearing is that there are these sort of big slugs of money coming in to subsidize the transition to electrification. And we also, Miles was talking about just electricity rates themselves as, a ongoing fuel cost. And are you able to say a little bit more about, what is motivating consumers to make these, different decisions about their mobility? What is the role of the long-term electric rate price signal compared with these, the incoming slugs in the form of the vehicle rebates, or is it the charging accessibility? Do you have insight into sort of what are, how those different decision drivers are prioritized, maybe?
So again, from sort of a medium and heavy duty perspective, commercial buses and trucks, which is really where CalSTART specializes, again, it's over the lifetime of the vehicle. And so we're looking at things like maintenance and operations, which, and there are citations for this, and I don't have them at my fingertips, but there tends to be less maintenance needed for these types of electric vehicles and so forth. Where we have variability is in the equation around, things like the expense of charging and something like demand charging. So I think with the funding that's coming to set up different programs, infrastructure, voucher programs, et cetera, clearly the reasons for doing it is cleaner air, things are more quiet, truck drivers can actually hear themselves, like for once in their lives, the emissions reduction, less dependency on foreign oil, national security perspective. So with that, I mean, there's only so much then that is in control. And I don't know if it's being subsidized so much it's being jump-started. I don't know if Nancy and Miles want to respond to that, but I really think over the long term for this to work day after day, year after year, the utility pricing and the rates are just going to play as they do in everything, right? Whether it's demand response or solar, et cetera, a huge role in whether this is viable over the long term outside of things like cost of production and then operations and maintenance.
Yeah, maybe to jump off that, I think it's important here to distinguish between the different types of drivers and fleet operators. So I think for fleet operators, there's the economic case they consider for light duty vehicle owners. For example, folks who are driving at fast charging stations. I think fuel cost savings are definitely a key element of that. There's a survey from one of the programs in California of 20,000 drivers where the biggest motivator they indicated for purchasing an EV was fuel cost savings. So I think it's an element of all the above. It's fuel cost savings, it's access and ease, making sure that it's not more difficult to buy, use, and recharge an EV than it is to use a conventional vehicle. And I think an important element of that is the reliability of the stations. So there was a recent study that came out in California indicating that there's some work to be done on maintenance and operation of charging stations to make sure that they are as easy to use and find as gas stations. But I think it's really making it as seamless an experience as possible for EV drivers, making sure that they are saving money on fuel costs if they're charging in line with grid conditions. And also, I think for a lot of light duty vehicle owners, just having that be a fun, cool experience. I think that's a big element in a lot of purchase decisions. So I think fuel cost savings are a big element, but it really is important, I think, to focus on all the above.
I'd like to go back to something that Commissioner Anthony said, which I think is important for this audience, which is, I agree, public utility commissioners, you don't regulate transportation, or at least this aspect of transportation. I mean, when I was at the Public Utilities Commission in California, we regulated things like airport shuttles and for a while even hot air balloons, if you can believe that, and the Napa Valley wine train. But what you do is important, both in terms of what we just heard Miles and Alyssa talk about in terms of the not erecting what might be artificial barriers to the business case for and the consumer experience for to encourage new adoption of new technologies that have other beneficial aspects, but bringing it down even to a more concrete level. Transportation electrification electrified vehicles are the biggest new load that the system is going to see over the next few decades. That and to some extent electrified buildings as well. And you look back at the experience of the last time the industry dealt with something like this, it was air conditioning in the post-war era. The modern grid is built to serve air conditioning, and to some extent, a lot of the principles of modern rate design and cost recovery are built around managing the impact of a very peaky air conditioning load on the overall system. So whether or not a commission sees itself as part of the state's overall objectives for transportation electrification, which obviously also vary from state to state. Some states this is a high priority, other states it's not. But no matter where you sit as a commissioner, it is going to be important to prepare to serve this load, because these cars and trucks are not just coming to the states that are I think 15 or 16 states that have opted into the California Zero Emission Vehicle Program and Advanced Clean Trucks regulations. There are compelling reasons to acquire these vehicles, and they are showing up everywhere. And this load really is different in the sense that it is a highly flexible load. And even DC fast charging has some flexibility, not so much built into it, but in some circumstances, it's possible to integrate on-site storage or on-site generation and storage as a way to smooth out that load. That might be the long-term solution for stations in really isolated areas, rather than a forever demand charge holiday for them. I'm not staking out that position, but throwing that idea out on the table. And as far as charging at depots is concerned, there's often a lot of flexibility in a fleet. It really just depends on, again, that's just part of the economics, and depends a lot on the vocation of the fleet. And there are whole new businesses springing up that are working with fleet operators to help them figure out how to strike that balance. And obviously, rate design is going to factor into the equation, more so for the commercial venture, or more so for a fleet than for an individual. But the last thing I want to say is, the real flexibility is in charging at home. That's just a huge resource. Cars are parked something like 95% of the time, and I don't think that's our focus today, but it's certainly part of the consideration of EV rates that the PURPA amendment is asking, or directing commissions to consider. And the last thing I'll say is, I began my career evaluating air conditioned recycling programs and figuring out how we could get people in, to participate in them. And I don't think that managing air conditioning load has been a resounding success. And I think part of that reason for that is because we kind of came in after the fact. And today this load is coming, it's growing, it's in the nascent phase. Consumers' expectations and understanding about their vehicle are, just being developed. And we have an opportunity to make this load an asset to the grid instead of, some expensive boat anchor that we drag around. And that applies in all 50 states and the territories as well. So I'm going to get off my economist / policymaker soapbox, but couldn't help putting that out there.
That's great, Nancy. We're thinking about all of that. Everything you just said is what we're thinking about in our office, and how do we make sure that the utility understands that they need to be laser focused on minimizing the cost of serving this load, so that we can make sure that electrification is a viable and equitable, climate solution. And part of anyway, but I do want to follow up on a couple of specific things that you said, and let others answer them. But, you talked a lot about the flexibility of electric vehicle load. And, here this panel is about EV rates, but, why are we talking about EV specific rates and not technology or load agnostic rates? Why shouldn't any customer with flexible load be given the opportunity to benefit from offering that flexibility to the distribution system?
I have an opinion about that, but I'm going to let others answer it first and see if there's anything left for me to say.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that one off. So I think a number of the rates that I flagged at the beginning, they sort of vary. Some of them are EV specific rates. There are some that are more tech neutral. So some of the low load factor rates, those are tech neutral. The Alabama power rate that I mentioned is tech neutral. But this is a question that has come up in several of the proceedings that NRDC has been engaged in, where commissions are grappling with, do we want to, have tech agnostic rates? Is it appropriate, at least in the near term, to have, EV specific rates? So just to give one maybe deeper example of this came up in a recent proceeding in California where they were trying to establish a transportation electrification framework. And the initial proposal in that proceeding proposed to have utilities develop a long-term EV rate revolution plan where they were asking questions about what is the appropriateness of EV-specific rates versus tech-agnostic rates. And so they highlighted the concerns about that some folks have raised about EV-specific rates elevating certain technologies above others and having a patchwork of rates potentially creating a barrier to different types of electrification. And where they ultimately came down is saying that EV-specific rates, at least now, provide critical value in spurring the EV market. But long-term, short-term, it's a reasonable near-term strategy to help spur that market transformation, but encouraging the utilities to long-term move towards more technology-neutral rates. So like that's how that's come up in that proceeding. But there are solutions that have been put into place that do help incentivize EV charging that either give them access to economic development riders or are just low load factor rates that are open to other types of technology. So there are models that are sort of both, like EV specific and tech agnostic.
Nothing from CalSTART on that one. So Nancy, I'm eager to hear your opinion.
I think I'll just paraphrase a couple of things that are just, emphasize a couple of things that Miles said. Is I think the short-term versus long-term distinction that Miles made is an important one. That again, we're in the nascent phase of serving this load, and in a period where expectations are being developed, and the way that people think about their vehicle and fleets, think about the economics of their fleet are being developed. And so even if you don't think a rate that has, even if you don't think a rate or any kind of subsidy is appropriate for this load, or deferring some cost recovery is appropriate for this load, I think it's still really critical to shine a spotlight on the benefits that load can provide. And the way to get people's attention is largely through price. And I'll just point, I think there's some really good resources to look at on this. Smart Electric Power, SEPA, I forget what the A stands for. Anyway, the SEPA has done some excellent reports on rate making and also design of demand response programs and other ways to cost effectively integrate EVs onto the grid. One of the things that they point out there that I think makes it desirable to do EV specific rates is that a lot of times people, they don't really want to think about the rest of the house. They really, they see the EV as separate, their car is separate from their house, and a rate that sometimes a DER specific rate, like Southern California Edison has adopted one for residential customers, that's just a whole house rate. And the car sort of gets lost in that. And I think we really want to shine a spotlight on the car. So, and the SEPA, one of the SEPA studies really had some good survey data that indicated that was really valuable. Smart Electric Power Alliance. Anyway, I highly recommend their reports. Very well researched.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that, on the sort of, maybe there's on the technological or the practical, the metering or telemetry side of the EV versus the whole house rate. We don't have AMI in the jurisdiction that I regulate. If for customers like ours who don't have AMI, are off-peak charging rates executable? Is there metering technology that's available just to the vehicle that can serve a different rate just to the vehicle?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question because, modern vehicles and, particularly the electric vehicles, the new generation that is coming, they are stuffed with sensors and microprocessors, and they have communications capabilities. They have a modem built in, and the car can service the meter. And we're seeing that piloted in a number of states. There's a really interesting proposal pending before the commission in North Carolina with the express intention of using the metrology inside the car. And what's nice about that is that it means that you can, bring your own charger. a lot of utilities are also going to commissions with proposals to pass out or subsidize, hand out rebates for smart level 2 chargers, which also can provide the metering service, but that's not really necessary. You can have a bring your own charger approach where you can use even just the cable that came with your car and use the car. And I think that's for cost conscious commissions. That's something that we really need to look at more deeply and advance, is how we can really leverage that capability and drive out redundant costs.
Thanks. You were also, you were mentioned, and this is going back a few minutes, but you were talking about the flexibility. The EV load is flexible. And one aspect of that flexibility is that it's mobile. And a lot of the time we hear, I hear a lot from like electric school bus people, potential electric school bus consumers, or and that the mobility is a benefit. It can move around, it could act as storage, but we hear from our utility that mobility adds a level, big level of uncertainty into their system planning, because you might have load that pops up in different places. Have any of you looked at is there analysis that the utility planners are using or thinking about with respect to that geographic uncertainty of where these loads might be?
I'm not aware of any analyses that look at that. I think it really depends, I think, on the use case of the vehicle. There are a lot where their duty cycle is relatively predictable. And I'll just note that I think that there are attempts at getting at more locational pricing in some recent proceedings. So the EV evolution plans that I mentioned earlier, they were looking at ways for utilities to figure out how to work with locational pricing. Likewise, there were some dynamic rates that were proposed and adopted in California, day-ahead wholesale prices, more dynamic rates for fleets that both PG&E and SDG&E developed, and I think there were some locational elements in those rates. We weren't actually deeply engaged in those proceedings, but I'm not aware of any analysis that's trying to, get at a more granular forecasting of where those vehicles might pop up. But I think that's a good question.
I mean, to some extent, I think it's about understanding the load, right? I mean, with school buses, these are projects between utilities and school bus operators with the view of, basically treating the depot as a giant battery when the buses are sitting there during the day. It's a different story when you're talking about personal vehicles, which move around all over the place. And those were the subject of the studies Miles mentioned that San Diego Gas and Electric did, where they were actually really trying to get people who had the opportunity to charge at work to do that on days when there was really high solar production, and that was the lowest cost period. And again, if you take advantage of telematics, the car knows where it is, and whoever is the third party aggregator who's managing the charging of the car, they can hear from the car where it is and what the state of charge is and optimize across locations. And BMW has done a series of studies with Pacific Gas and Electric where they did exactly that. There's an excellent report on that from a project that was funded by the California Energy Commission that looks at how they accomplish that. So again, that's a real value add from taking advantage of telematics. Alyssa, I think you had your hand up. So
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that for things thinking about load and forecasting, the importance of what we're seeing in some states, but not all, which are required transportation and electrification plans from utilities that are under the jurisdiction of a commission. I think these frameworks are incredibly important to be looking ahead, 5 and 10 years, and having those plans being submitted to the commissions to review to better understand where we can expect to see planned load increases, and also I think sharing and transparency of data in terms of what's needed in terms of interconnection. So I'm based in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has been working for a while to try to pass some TEP enabling legislation, which has not happened. But because of that, and I think maybe some uncertainty on the part of the commission about what they can or can't do, we've sort of been in a stasis. And so that has affected, I think, Pennsylvania's ability, our utilities, the commission, to move more quickly on some of these issues. So I just want to underscore there, Commissioner, to your question, the importance of something like a transportation electrification plan. California has an entire framework that the CPUC put out and is currently updating, but I think that that's a really exhaustive document for other states to be looking at. And I just think advanced planning, like for anything else, is going to be extremely important for this process.
Hey, Alyssa, you mentioned earlier that you work that CalSTAR works in many states, and you even mentioned that you work internationally. Starting electricity prices are also really different across states, and I imagine very different across countries. Do you have insight into how those relative cost differences inform electric vehicle adoption or electric vehicle acceleration strategies in those different states?
The short answer is I do not, and I'm not sure if CalSTAR has done that analysis. I think maybe ICCT or others have. It's a great question. I'll just sort of anecdotally say, in Connecticut, PURA currently has a proceeding open related to medium and heavy duty electrification. Connecticut electricity prices are really high. I mean, these are definitely factoring in to decisions. And I'm sure that there's a study out there on it, but I just don't have an answer in the immediate. It's a great question.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think some of the examples that we flagged before, some of the earlier states to try to crack this nut, were states where they were seeing really high electricity prices, where the cost to refuel a vehicle, especially on rates that had demand charges, frequently was more expensive than charging a conventional fueled vehicle. So I think that's part of the problem. That's part of what's motivated a lot of utilities to get at this. And I think it's important not just for fleet operators, but also infrastructure providers. If you're trying to figure out where to install infrastructure, what areas to focus on, states where the economics are really tricky given rates, especially if you're in service territories where, on one side of the line, those rates might be really high. On the other side, they might be a little bit lower. Like, I think that does affect deployment decisions. So I think that's a really relevant consideration, especially in the states that are seeing really high electricity prices. There are some states across the country where electricity prices are lower, and I think that economic case for the fuel cost savings is not as steep, but I think still providing incentives and fuel cost savings for drivers who charge in line with grid conditions, if you're sending time use price signals, if you're trying to help facilitate integration of renewable energy and help manage the grid like we talked about earlier, I think those are all additional things that you can focus on beyond just like fuel cost savings and highlight the importance of rate design to help enhance the electrification strategy and the deployment of this infrastructure.
And Alyssa, I want to stick with you for just a minute here. As somebody who's working with fleet owners, this has come up at some of our NARUC meetings in the past. And do you have insight? Do you see whether when a fleet owner is looking to determine where to put in their charging or where to locate their charging, are they making those decisions based on price signals that are coming from the distribution system? Like, are they looking at where the interconnection costs are the lowest? If they have some flexibility, if their fleet might have multiple locations, are they working with the utilities to understand where the costs of charging are going to require the least system upgrades? Or are those decisions driven by other factors?
I would say they're currently driven by other factors, and not to call them short-sighted, but I think right now fleets are not even aware of the large range of vehicle availability. So I think first and foremost, fleets are surprised to hear they can electrify certain sizes of vehicles. And then once that's sort of tackled, then the next question is this is going to cost me more upfront? So what is available in terms of an incentive or a payment plan to access the vehicle and then receive it. I think that your question about pricing and dynamic pricing and location siting are so important, and they're not at the top of mind. I think groups like CalSTART, but many others are trying to do more to socialize the need to, be interacting with your utility sort of right away. CalSTART administers a program in California, the heavy vehicle, it's called HVIP, and like Nancy on CPI. Anyway, I'll put it in the link. So there's so much that fleet operators are considering, and really there's a lot to still do in terms of, like, I think fleet operators still feel intimidated by the idea of electric vehicles. So again, a lot of socializing that the technology does exist now. I just wanted to say on location, there's a question between publicly available charging and then privately owned charging. I think for a lot of vehicles that are domiciled in the same place every night, which is a lot of, those Amazon delivery trucks, school buses, etc., they know that they're going to build the charger there because that's where the vehicles are going to come back to and they'll be able to charge. A question, a point that I think is coming up is that, fleet owners are then getting excited and they make these plans, and then they do finally, probably too late, reach out to the utility, and they find out that that amount of load cannot be interconnected. It's not available at that time. And that puts a wrench in things. So, it would also be fantastic, I think, to hear from NARUC. I know that there's an EV working group and others about, again, how we can get out in front, interfacing with fleet owners and other entities to sort of, hey, if you want to go electric, here's like a quick checklist, right, of things you could think about, but more on the utility oriented side, not so much, how do you plug in a charger type thing.
Yeah, I think those are all great points Elisa just made. And just to kind of bring some of those back also to the role of the regulator, is that, we're looking for the least cost solution in the short run and the long run. And when a company starts to electrify a fleet, they're going to do it gradually, right? Because as vehicles retire, they're going to replace them with electric vehicles. They're not just, most fleets won't just send all their vehicles off to wherever old vehicles go and, fill the parking lot with EVs the next day. That's not how it's going to work. And that means that there'll be kind of one charger, and then maybe a little down the road, there'll be some more chargers, and that load will build up over time. And so that really raises the question, which I think is tough for regulators, of, future proofing. I mean, there's a concern that if you build ahead of load, then you may wind up with a stranded cost. On the other hand, you've got a business, in the case of a fleet, usually a business, it might be municipal, but like they are making significant capital investments of their own to upgrade the yard, to buy the vehicles. And so if you think about, going in the first time when there's 2 trucks on the lot, but there's going to be 20 in 5 years or 3 years, whatever, do you want to do it right the first time, or do you want to have to the utility to come back like a few years down the road and have to not just replace the transformer, but like maybe, excavate a new bigger vault. So when you have this kind of wholesale transformation, it's really important to encourage the utilities you regulate to really think about it holistically with a long-term view. And that's, that takes you back to some of the planning tools. And the one I'm familiar with from work I did years ago with Wright Electric is they used a tool called Load Seer, which is used for distribution system planning. I'm sure there's other tools just like it. That was the one that they used. But they were actually kind of early involved in an early stage in forecasting EV load on those circuits. And that's a utility that had already struggled a lot to with the level of solar PV adoption, rooftop PV adoption in service territory. So it was already conditioned to be thinking about what was going on at the tendrils of its distribution grid. But I do think that there are, increasingly sophisticated tools and particularly when you're talking about individual vehicles, there's a stochastic aspect to this, right? I mean, you don't know exactly which house they're going to land at, but you could do simulations. And I think those are getting better and smarter with big data and sophisticated computing and a lot of intellectual horsepower going into it.
Thanks. We were just hearing from one of the electric companies that we regulate about their grid modernization investment plan, about a 10-year plan. And what the planners were describing is that their investments in sensing and control technologies and visibility will allow them to reliably serve all of this new load that they anticipate coming on the system, and a lot of new generation too, right? A lot of new generation coming on our system, and it will, as the planners described it, having those capabilities and that functionality will allow them to avoid building the system to extremes, right? They weren't really talking about minimizing the cost of the system, but they were talking about being able to reliably serve load and accommodate generation without an extreme build out of the system. And then the conversation sort of moved into, well, how are those grid modernization investments going to allow the utility to deliver location specific marginal prices, so that we have that granular level of price information that will send price signals to where load is cheap to serve and where it's more expensive to serve, and ideally use that information to minimize the cost of the system. And their response was, that's even beyond while they have the physical capability to understand the system, or they will at that granular locational level, they won't have the cost information for beyond that 10-year horizon. So they were looking, maybe a dozen or 15 years out, what they would have the capability to understand avoided cost or marginal cost to serve at the distribution system. They did explain they could send time of use or dynamic, variable prices that reflect wholesale market conditions that the ISO is sending, but not at the retail level. And that makes us think that, okay, but there can be divergence between wholesale market conditions and what's happening on the distribution system. Sometimes power is needed on the transmission system or in the state of Rhode Island generally, but probably not on a specific feeder that has lots of distributed generation or storage on it already. These marginal costs are really location specific. And so what is I guess it's a two-part question, how do you think about this in rate setting? How do you think about this in rate setting generally? And also, what do you understand about the distribution utilities capabilities in the states that you're working, their capability to understand the avoided costs on the distribution system?
Maybe I'll say a little bit to begin. I mean, smart grid. Pardon me. Smart grid means a lot of things, beyond smart meters. I mean, as you said, there's a lot of intelligence being embedded all over the grid. And I don't doubt that some utilities that are kind of further down the grid modernization road have that kind of visibility. But I think particularly on the locational front, but I think if you sort of think about two historical experiences, the notion of locational pricing seems actually, as a practical matter, a bit far-fetched to me. Going back nearly 100 years, you think about the Rural Electrification Administration, that whole initiative, as well as the build out of the telephone network. The idea was that, we wanted to take advantage of network externalities, that it was valuable to everybody, to have everybody on the system, whether it was, from the telephone system, you want to be able to call everybody and have them call you, or the power system. I think it was kind of more of a, notion of equity. And that's really baked into, I think, rate making and utility regulation for, nearly 100 years, is the idea of universal service and postage stamp pricing, where everybody pays the same. We don't send a higher bill to the, um, um, little old lady on the mountaintop, so that she can, her phone can be connected. That's the example we used in my college econ class. On the other hand, fast forward. So I think you could get a lot of, pushback on well, this is discriminatory and it's not really consistent with universal service. Fast forward, I mean, we've spent like, I don't know, 20 years in California at least, and well past a decade of having smart meters in every home that are, capable of implementing just plain old time of use pricing. And that was a huge fight, and it's still being rolled out. And the idea of something that's, that's sort of spatial equivalent of, of real-time pricing for, anybody but, sophisticated customers who opt into it, that seems pretty impractical to me, or just, not really, I forget what Wright said about that. Feasibility of application and interpretation and public acceptability. Those were a couple of his principles. I think those are going to be tough on this in this regard.
And just to build off what Nancy said, I think that's what we saw. There was one rate that I mentioned earlier where two of the California utilities, the commission directed them to come forward with hourly real-time like dynamic rates in approving their original commercial EV rates. And so PG&E has one. It's an optional day ahead hourly real-time rate. It replaces the time of use generation rate in their commercial EV rate with a CAISO day ahead hourly signal based on the forecasted load on the system and the forecasted amount of greenhouse gas free generation. So it's got three components there, but importantly, like Nancy said, that rate is optional. The commission was recognizing that very complicated rates may only be attractive to a number of more sophisticated customers. And so I think we get at this another point that we talked about earlier, which is, how do you design rates for a number of different customers? Do you have optional rates? Do you have a portfolio of rates for different customers? How do you balance that to meet the different types of customers, the varying levels of sophistication from folks who are just regular customers driving an EV, going to public charging, and more sophisticated fleets that have, load management technologies, more sophisticated options. So I think one thing that we've seen emerging is having, in any case like that, some of those rates be optional and letting customers determine if they want to face those signals. And then I think there's also a short and long-term element here. This was part of what was discussed with the EV evolution plans in the transportation electrification framework proceeding, where we're still relatively nascent in the EV market for a lot of customers. And I think from things as simple as like time of use rates to dynamic rates, it's important to plan and think through like what the appropriateness is of having those rates be opt-in versus having those be default. So the original EV rate revolution plans that were proposed by the commission contemplated getting to default time of use over like a 10-year period and potentially getting to default dynamic for fleet customers. So I think those are just a number of the considerations that come into play with rates of varying levels of sophistication.
I will just add, FHWA as part of NEVI is looking to collect information on things like costs, and they're going to ask the states to be submitting this information on a quarterly and annual basis. I think it will be an interesting question to see what's done with that data. But also, again, Commissioner, you had mentioned the different electricity prices, and the federal agencies right now are really trying to emphasize, again, the standardization and that one person isn't paying more than the other. They really are focusing on reliability. So how that data collection will interface at all with some of what, the commission see in terms of data submitted. A lot of things being asked for at the moment, with, I think, implementation being a question. And the document I'm referring to, it hasn't been published in the Federal Register yet, but this is the draft language of the proposed rulemaking for the requirements and standards of the NEVI program, which looks to put EV infrastructure across interstates as well as other places in states.
There's a couple of questions from the viewers that I I don't think anyone's answered yet. So I'm gonna let's do a couple of those before we get to sort of closing questions. We have a question. Again, I don't think you've answered it, but the asker is inquiring, how can we use level 2 charging to flatten curves or spikes in DC fast charging? Specifically, are there behavioral programs in place that are examining this? That
So
Not sure
I'm gonna-
quite
oh,
But
go ahead.
I don't know, Miles, do you have an interpretation? It's difficult to parse what the question's asking.
Yeah, so I think the way that I'm interpreting it is, are there additional things outside of just rates that can incentivize like flattening, different changes in like customer behavior? Like, are there complementary policies and programs that can be stacked with rates? So, for example, there are programs like SDG&E has a vehicle grid integration pilot program that's an incentive program for installing EV charging infrastructure. It includes a number of conditions on participation. So there are policies I think that can be stacked with it, but I think there's maybe another element of the question. Just thinking about the difference between like level 2 and DC fast charging. There are like automated load management technologies, things that would be I think in thinking through like customer responses, we have to think through like price signals and like the tools for customers to manage their load. So maybe one thing just to flag here is I think it's important to note in a lot of cases, again, we just have a very wide variation of customers across this class, from folks who are at a public fast charging station, folks who are a fleet at a depot, and there's going to be a varying appetite to respond to price signals. So public DC fast charging stations, I think one of their key goals is to offer a very like seamless pricing experience. So even if you send sophisticated price signals to those locations, or if you send time of use price signals to those locations, the ones that are charging there aren't the ones that are paying the utility. That's going to be the charging station operator, the one who owns the site potentially. And so I think that's another important distinction for regulators and utilities to think about in designing rates, is that price signals can be an important element, load management is an important element, but you really have to think of the end use case and what the one who's in charge of controlling the vehicle, the person who's receiving the signal from the utility, what are their key considerations in those different use cases?
And I'll just add quickly, I think this goes back to planning, right? And why advanced planning in the form of like a TEF would be important. We don't like, more is not better necessarily. We don't need chargers everywhere if they're not going to be used at all or once a day. I think it's really important to consider, how many times they'll be used. And then also the other thing is, just because DC fast charging exists, it's not the best. It allows you to get a charge quickly, which is different than charging your vehicle. And if you don't need to do it quickly, a level 2 charging absolutely suffices. And so there are, all of these kind of variables that go into it. I don't think that we want to install like 600 DC fast chargers and have everybody use those only. We really want to make sure that there's an awareness towards, what's good for the battery over the life of the battery in the vehicle, as well as what's going to work for the grid. And Commissioner, what you were talking about with the load planning and thinking that through. So if anything, I think it would be great if NARUC and commissions were more involved perhaps than I've seen to date in some of these discussions that the federal agencies are having with the implementation of IIJA. I think commissions are so important to a lot of these pieces and perhaps haven't been as well represented, which I realize is not, necessarily, I don't know, but it would just be fantastic, because I think DOTs are one entity, but they can't be expected to do everything. And ultimately, I think when we think about an electrified world, be it businesses, buildings, or vehicles, it really is going to sit ultimately, I think, in the realm of the PUCs. So having commissioners and commission staff involved now when we're trying to figure this stuff out, I think would be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, I just want to jump on that and say, first of all, thank you, Commissioner Anthony, and thanks to Neri for putting on this seminar today. I think it, is apparent from just the alphabet soup of acronyms that we all spewed out, not to mention all the various, technical terms and terms of art, that there's just an ocean of complexity in, in the world of transportation electrification, and that, a lot of it really, I think, energy regulators ignore at their peril, that ultimately it just means, more cost for the customers whose, pocketbook you are most focused on. And to that end, I'll just, put on my auto innovators hat. As I said at the outset, I'm not here representing them, but my firm works closely with them, and our mission is to help them, the auto industry, communicate more effectively with utilities and their regulators. And I'm going next week to speak at a EV Academy that they're having for state legislators, and to just acquaint them with the, ABCs and PDQs and L2s and V to Gs. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think that, the organizations, trade association that represents 99% represents the companies that sell 99% of the vehicles sold in the US today. So basically all the familiar household words except Tesla. And, that's the kind of educational initiative to, help people be effective legislators or help people be effective regulators and really fulfill their mission to their people they're supposed to serve. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we would really like to foster and support in any way that we can. And personally, something that I'm very committed to.
All right, we're going to start to wrap up. And so I'm going to give everybody a choice of a final question. Either, what is the single most important thing to get right in the short term or the long term? Or if that's a little too academic, maybe a fun question of, what is the funniest or craziest question you've ever gotten about electrification? So it's your call how you want to close out. But remember that this is NRRI's last webinar, and we should do it justice. So Nancy, why don't you go first?
Well, I've talked a lot, so I'll just say I was amused the other day when a friend of mine, someone Commissioner, asked me about, is it possible to jumpstart an EV? And I pointed out that it doesn't have a starter motor because it doesn't have an engine.
Awesome. We'll turn to Alyssa next.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to have this dialogue, and would love to continue to be involved with those on the line. It's a little tricky when we just see our own faces and not all of you who are also on the call. But again, thank you for giving your time. I mean, I think the language, I forget the section, Miles, miscellaneous number in IIJA for PURPA 111D about, commissions really opening an EV docket. I think that if your state doesn't have an EV docket, it needs to have an EV docket. I also think that the transportation electrification plans are so important right now, and those should be done. But I'll just share as like a funny thing, I wanted to make sure I was walking the walk. I have a 2018 Nissan Leaf. I've had it for 4 years. I currently, when I need to charge it, which is about every 2 weeks, charge it through the window in my kitchen through an outlet, like the same way I plug in my coffee machine. So, we've come a long way, which is to say you don't have to do that, but you can. And so a certain grittiness is still necessary at this nascent phase. But I think, as Nancy pointed out in her opening remarks, I mean, the load that transportation electrification will bring will be enormous. And it's really an opportunity, I think, for the United States to rise to the occasion with the existing grid infrastructure that we have, the level of innovation that we have across the country, and to see what we can do with it in terms of reducing emissions, but keeping reliability and affordability. So thank you again very much for having me today.
Thank you. And Miles, last word.
Yeah, thank you. I think Alyssa and Nancy covered a lot of it. I'll just say, building off their points, that while it might not be possible to jumpstart an EV, like Alyssa said, there's a lot that can be done right now to help jumpstart the EV market. So I think rates are one critical component of implementing EJA, but there are a number of other policies and things that states and utilities, stakeholders should consider in trying to really make that money go further, trying to really put the right policies in place to make sure that EVs are a grid asset, that we're getting folks into vehicles that reduce dangerous air pollution, and that we're deploying infrastructure in places where we're making sure that accessibility is equitable and that folks all across the country have the opportunity to benefit from EV adoption. So I'll just stop with that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nancy and Miles and Alyssa. I think this was a great discussion and a really wonderful way to end the years of dedication, experience, and expertise that NRI has provided to NARUC and provided to our stakeholder community. I was really honored to be able to share this last hurrah with you all, and Tom and Jeff. I wish you the best of luck in the future, and